Join our Patreon.
Do you really want to know? We are MythVision.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be a fantastic show dealing with mystery schools, pagan parallels, dying and rising gods. Don't click off. Watch the whole damn thing because it's going to get great. We just got the juices flowing. I got to hit record. Let's get rolling. Derek, take us into this, brother.
All right. So, Derek, I've been on your show before. We've discussed pagan parallels. We've discussed dying and rising gods and the mystery religions. I happen to know quite a bit about this stuff, but I want to introduce you to someone who knows vastly more than I do. I was introduced to Neal several years ago online, and this guy is he is a beast when it comes to the whole pagan parallels thing, comparative religion and all that. If you visit his website, I think it's mythodoxy.wordpress.net, if I'm not mistaken, you'll just find loads of good stuff, incredible information.
I'll put it down below in the description.
Yeah, absolutely. So can we go ahead and Neal, have you introduce yourself first?
Sure, yeah. My name's Neal Boswell. As Derek mentioned, I run the blog mythodoxy.wordpress, or alternatively mythicism.net is a short URL for that website, where basically I share my thoughts about the same subject matter, comparative mythology. The reason I have such a passion for it is very similar to you guys, because it was the main catalyst for my deconversion from Christianity. Basically born and raised a Christian, most of my life a Baptist, Southern Baptist. And in my early 20s, I converted to Seventh-day Adventism, and they are very big on comparative mythology, but they only take it up to a point in so much as it incriminates their arch nemesis, the Roman Catholic Church. But where it starts to incriminate Jesus himself, that's where they stop short. But in teaching me those things, they piqued my curiosity. And so I took the research further and learned, oh, wow, there's a whole bunch of stuff that actually incriminates Jesus in the Gospels as well. So here I am.
Awesome. Thank you for joining, bro. Derek, read that David Litwa passage and let's catapult into this thing so everybody watching can go ahead and say, holy crap, I didn't know that. Now I do.
Yeah, so David Litwa is a great scholar of Mediterranean religions, and I first came across his work in Iusus Deus, the depiction of Jesus as a Mediterranean god, and just incredible work, the way he dives in and completely debunks the apologetics with concern to the influence of Hellenism in early Christianity. I mean, he just destroys some of the arguments of N.T. Wright in the resurrection of the Son of God.
Dr. Price calls him N.T. wrong.
Wrong. And also makes these great comparisons to Hercules and Asclepius and Romulus with regard to their corporeal immortalizations, or you could possibly call it resurrection as such, since there is a death element when it comes to both Hercules and Asclepius. But anyway, just does this outstanding job. I was thoroughly impressed with him. And then most recently, this book that he's written, the name of this again, How the Gospels Became History. He goes after the mythicist camp, including Richard Carrier, and here's what he writes. And it's just really strange because it seems like he's doing a total 180 here, but he writes, time and time again, the biblical maxim proves true. There is nothing new under the sun, Ecclesiastes 1:9. No single deed or saying in Jesus is unique in the sense of being without parallel, because nothing in human history is without parallel. If the mythicist databank is world mythology ranging from 1800 BC to 100 CE, then any creative mythicist can chalk up a host of parallels to Jesus. It is simply a matter of blasting Jesus' life into small enough bits that represent single actions or motifs stripped out of narrative context. Jesus was born from a virgin. Addis was born from a virgin. Jesus brought baptism of fire. Zoroaster brought baptism of fire. Jesus rose from the dead. Osiris rose from the dead, and so on. Never mind that the parallels come from radically different times and cultures. Never mind that they are shorn of their context and mean almost nothing as individual units. Never mind that the parallels never add up to a coherent story that looks anything like the portraits of Jesus in the Gospels. The parallels in shards are there. Really would like to hear, I've got a lot to say about this, but would love to get Neal's response. Because again, I'm blown away with how when Litwin approaches the comparative religion topic in Isus Deus, he does this incredible job exposing this stuff. But again, it's 180 degrees the other way when he's addressing mythicists. So Neal, I'm gonna let you take it away, buddy.
Yeah, that is a bit strange. I'll have to read this other book that you're talking about, where he addresses Hercules and Asclepius and Romulus, because those are areas I'm not too well studied in, but it does fascinate me. So I'd like to read his work on that. But yeah, the two things you just described seems like there's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on. I've heard this similar argument before, time and time again. And my first response is definitely everything he just listed in that article could be said by a Jew to argue that Jesus is not the Christ, that everything's taken out of context. You're just cherry picking parallels from the Old Testament that are from disparate, eras and different cultures and disparate, authors, and trying to hodgepodge them into this character you call Jesus. Comparative mythology is at the root of the genesis of Christianity. It's just that they want to keep it, as long as you keep it isolated within the context of Judaism, then they're okay with it. But as soon as you extend that out into the world abroad that Christianity rose in, then we're going too far. But we're not doing anything different than the authors of the New Testament did themselves with the Old Testament. So that's my first thought on the matter.
Yeah. And I've noticed that, and I know you'll have a lot to say about this, that, you'll see classicists, scholars who, have a background in the Greco-Roman world. Lit was a good example. Bart Ehrman is a good example of this. That, look, if you want to make comparisons with other myths or deities or ideas from the Greco-Roman world or from the Hellenistic world, okay, that's acceptable. But if you go beyond that, if you go into any other culture like Egypt or Persia, that's just a stretch too far. Now you're out of bounds, and that stuff is that's off limits. You do an incredible job on your blog where you talk about syncretism between Yahweh and Horus and other, I think, Greek and Jewish examples, those kinds of syncretisms. You really show how the process of cultural diffusion and syncretism goes back well before Christianity. And anyway, I'm going to let you take it away there and discuss that.
That's definitely another key point, especially at the end where Litwin talks about how these parallels are in shards and how they're kind of taken out of, stripped of their context. As he said, that's not the case at all. The idea of comparing Jesus with pagan deities didn't just appear out of the ether, and it didn't appear from opponents of Christianity. As you mentioned in that blog I cover on my article, if we humor the Trinitarian premise that Jesus is one with Yahweh, or he's some kind of avatar, or in some way he is syncretized with Yahweh, Elohim, Adonai, whatever name you want to pick for it. If that's the case, if we humor that premise, then for centuries before his birth, Jesus was already being explicitly conflated with these other gods from these other cultures, and not just by those cultures, but by Jews in Palestine themselves. There's lots of archaeological and textual evidence to show that there was worship of Osiris and Horus and Isis being done in Palestine for us, basically from the Hellenistic period through to the Roman era. And the same can be said for conflating Adonai with the Syrian god Adonis, or most notably in the Maccabees, it says that they outright, and later on, Plutarch was on to say this as well, that the Jews outright verbatim conflated Dionysus or Bacchus of the Greeks and Romans with Yahweh. And like, especially the line where Plutarch says they didn't do this just through obscure hints. They plainly said, yes, our God is Bacchus. So it doesn't get much more, clear and explicit than that. We've had similar discussions before. It seems that retorts like this that Litwa, that you just read from Litwa there, are kind of, how to put it delicately, he's viewing things in a vacuum is probably about the best way I could say it.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was my first impression, Neal, and I'm not as well read as either of you guys or any of these scholars. I'm just a student, but the more I'm looking into this, the more the Hellenistic world seems to be a blend, to be in a pocket with zero influence on outside sources. To me, is like pretending there were just these ancient Amish people that had no way, they weren't into technology. Now, there were some Jews like that, but is that what we find in the New Testament? No. In fact, I would go so far as to say maybe some of these Jews are the reason why the war happened, but you're not finding that in the New Testament. It seems like there's a Hellenistic blend going on. And scholars, I can list, tons of them that I've been researching, will tell you, and these are like more conservative on the critical side, like you have like, if you were to name Bart Ehrman to a Christian, oh no, that's definitely not a conservative. Well, to us, he kind of is, and there's reasons why. But when you look on that side, these are conservative scholars that are going, look at Paul's thinking. Whoever authored Paul, it permeates with Stoicism and Platonic thought. And to act like this guy is purely in the milieu of Judaism only is really, that's a long stretch. So where do we draw the line? We want to open up and try and see what mystery stuff found its way into Paul's thinking, but we don't want to just open the door full fling and not have evidence to back up what we're saying. So I guess if we can get into some parallels that you guys find or different things, that would be awesome for our audience to see. Even Litwa said some good stuff there in that quote you had, Derek. It's like, hold on, Osiris resurrected and Jesus resurrected, but people want to get nitpicky, but Jesus resurrected in his physical body and he was on earth for 40 days, but not Osiris. Where do you draw the line? So I'll leave it to you guys in terms of connecting dots.
Well, since you just mentioned Paul there and his influence from, Hellenistic and Stoic thinking and mystery school thinking, I mean, I'm not sure that Paul mentions this in his own writings, but in the book of Acts, it portrays Paul as explicitly conflating Yahweh, or the God of the Bible, with the unknown God on Mars Hill. And for historical context, for any listeners that may not know, Mars Hill was kind of this metropolis of pagan polytheism. It was this like sanctuary where there was an altar dedicated to every type of god under the sun, so to speak. And then if your god happened to not have an altar with its name explicitly on it, they had a miscellaneous altar that was to the unknown god. Like basically if you're, say, a Chinaman wandering through town and your particular god doesn't happen to be named on one of the other altars because you're from so far away, well, go to miscellaneous altar of the unknown god. But the point being, this was a pagan site, and Paul was preaching to pagans, and he goes, hey, that unknown God you're talking about, that's my God. And, right there, he had no problem with conflating his God with the God of pagans. Again, but that's to be taken with a grain of salt because that's in Acts, and whether or not Acts gives us an accurate version of Paul is, remains to be seen. But nevertheless, I mean, it's a canonical book in the New Testament portraying Paul this way. And then also in Acts, it tells us, I forget which city in particular it was, but Paul and Barnabas were going through the city preaching, and the people of that town explicitly conflated Paul with Hermes Trismegistus and conflated Barnabas with Zeus by name. This is in the Bible. Go look it up. I mean, so you have, you already have to some degree this like wink and nod within the New Testament itself, like, hey, get what we're saying, get what we're doing here. Paul was like, Hermes Trismegistus, because I'm sure you've even read this from Dr. Robert Price. There's a lot of material in the Hermetic corpus that overlaps with early Christian thinking and theology. So
He even said the Paul quote of kicked against the goads is verbatim plagiarized, not, and Dr. Price is sensitive. He's like, listen, I didn't say it's plagiarism. I said that this is, borrowing concepts here. No, he tells me, and this is big coming from him because he's careful. He says it's verbatim taken from Dionysus the Bacchae, the kick against the goads. So yes, I'm with you 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, since you mentioned the Bacchae by, I think it was Euripides, that reminds me of something I wanted to kind of throw in here, because I listened to one of the previous episodes you'd done with Derek, and you mentioned how the cultural influence between Jews and pagans goes both ways, and you were interested in hearing more about, like, okay, how much did Jews influence pagan culture? And I actually do think that a lot of what's in the Bacchae does have some of that reverse influence. While there are some things we find from the Bacchae that made its way down into the New Testament, especially in Acts, I do also think it took some influence from Judaism and some Old Testament things, like where it talks about how the servants of Dionysus could strike the ground with their rod and out would come milk and honey out of the ground. And that, so that definitely, I think, has some influence. I think there were a few other examples. They escape me at the moment, but yeah, they escape me at the moment. But I think that's an example of what you were looking for there.
I'll jump in there. As far as the that excerpt from Litwa's book, it seems like what some of these scholars want to do is they want to hermetically seal these cultures off from one another, so that any kind of comparisons that are made are invalid or illegitimate. And I'm not so sure you can do that. One of the problems I think that exists in scholarship, and Neal, I think you can probably back me on this, is that Egyptologists and classicists, they're working in two completely separate disciplines, and they don't speak to one another, at least by and large. That seems to be the case. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if you're reading Jan Assman, whom I would marry just to acquire his surname because it's amazing. But Jan Assman, or Louis Zachbar, or Mark J. Smith, I think it is, Eric Hornung, you really open a window into the work of these Egyptologists on your blog. Can you tell us more about, what you cover regarding the resurrection of Osiris, the nature of the resurrection body in ancient Egypt, and that kind of thing?
Sure. And I'm glad you said that, how it seems like they operate in two different worlds.
Yes.
One of the examples being the previously mentioned Bart Ehrman, which I'm not sure that he's a classicist. I think he's just like a New Testament specialist. But nevertheless, you can tell he's well studied in the classics, of course. I think that's part of the requirements for his credentials. But when he says explicitly in his book, like, this is the standard view of Egyptologists on the matter, that there was no bodily resurrection of Osiris. I'm thinking, like, how many Egyptologists has he read? Like, I can think of 12 off the top of my head right now who state exactly the opposite, and you name 5 of them right there. Yeah, definitely, it's a bizarre type of thinking. Per my research and readings, the way that rose about this thinking that Osiris did not have a bodily resurrection, basically is an anachronism that developed in the immediate wake of the translating of the Rosetta Stone. Because once the knowledge to how to decode Egyptian hieroglyphs and knowledge of the Egyptian language in general kind of faded out and disappeared at around the fall of the Roman Empire, all during the medieval period, we had no knowledge, no firsthand knowledge of what the indigenous Egyptian text actually said about the matter. So it was a lot of guesswork, and it was a lot of basically theologians and scholars of the medieval period getting gleanings about the culture through the classics, through Greek and Roman authors who wrote about it when it was still a relevant culture. But then when we finally got the Rosetta Stone and were able to translate Egyptian hieroglyphs, we kind of, the first scholars who I guess you could say founded the field of Egyptology, they kind of came at it with that filter on of their like Christianized, or at the very least like their Western Romanized kind of thinking, maybe even if they weren't necessarily Christians, if they were still like deists and still had this like westernized filter on, they kind of read that back into the Egyptian culture because they were encountering terms and concepts that had been lost basically for over 1,000 years, and that they didn't really have a parallel for. So they just kind of read a parallel into that. So when they encountered concepts like the Ba and the Ka, which you mentioned before, or the Ak, they kind of like, all right, well, in some cases, in some pictures, and in some phrases, it sounds like it might be counterpart to the function of what we call a soul or a ghost or whatever. But as more and more indigenous Egyptian texts came to be translated, and we got a clearer picture of how they viewed man in his existence and his posthumous existence, it's become quite clear. And it's now, based on what I've read, I say it's the majority view amongst Egyptologists that Egyptians were definitely physical resurrectionists. They believed in a corporeal afterlife that maybe not necessarily took place here on this planet. You know, they believed that the Duat, the underworld as we call it, kind of encompassed both, I guess, a portion of outer space and the earth beneath us, because they believed that like the sky was like a circuit and it ran both over this world and over the underworld, so to speak. But nevertheless, as Derek has mentioned before, they definitely believed that you had to physically resurrect in the same physical body that you had here on earth, and then that body has to, through magical incantations, be ascended to heaven and then travel with those stars into the underworld through the western horizon. And that's how you got to Osiris's kingdom. It wasn't like this, you know, I've heard people describe the Osirian resurrection as similar to like the Greek idea of apotheosis, that like you just kind of appear, once you die here, your body decomposes and you just kind of poof appear in heaven as this incorporeal spirit. That wasn't the case at all.
Okay, you touched on something very important, because I want to shift gears straight to Jesus. I mean, you said that beautifully. I've never heard it said like that, actually. I've never, like, that made so much sense. How do I want to phrase this? Astro Theology, right? People see celestial motifs in the New Testament, and they think it's all just this secret code. And not saying there's not an astro-theological thing there, like a journey through the celestial sky, but does the corporeal, the real physical body resurrection, the same kind of concept, play its role here? Was that a Jewish thing? Did they take that from possibly an Egyptian concept here, that they had a physical bodily resurrection, and then when that bodily resurrection happens, did they have the idea of now they're going to the heavens, they're going to travel the sky, so to speak, with Jesus? Hint, hint, I go to prepare a place for you. In my Father's house, there are many houses or mansions. Sounds like zodiac signs, or something's going on here where you're going to end up in the stars. You're going to go to heaven. But I asked that in the vein of the church has, you know, taught as a doctrine, a foundational doctrine, that there's a physical bodily resurrection that is going to happen. Paul sounds very like a spiritual body. Orthodox Church said, hey, no, this is flesh and blood. Hint, hint, fill my wounds, Thomas. You know, where's that play a role? How do you want to answer that? I don't care how, but just, it'd be really cool to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, as we know from the Gospels and other texts from that time, there were, much like there are many denominations of Christianity today, there were different sects of Judaism back then with competing views about, you know, salvation and eschatology and things of that nature. And you can find basically representations of the three major factions within the New Testament. You know, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes, and each one of them had a view about afterlife that corresponds with the views you just elaborated on. Like, for instance, the Gospels even mentioned that the Sadducees did not believe in a spirit or a soul. They didn't believe in a resurrection. They didn't believe in angels. They believe you get this one life on earth, that's it. And the reason that you practice their religion is just so that you have a more comfortable life here on earth, and maybe a longer life here as well, but you don't get an afterlife. And then the Pharisees, of course, did believe in a soul, but they believed you had to have a physical resurrection to have an afterlife. And as far as I know, while I'm not too well read on the Essenes, but just kind of being an armchair reader, from what I've gathered about their views on the afterlife, they have one of the views you just mentioned, which is that you survive in some kind of incorporeal, like a spirit resurrection, so to speak. Like we just said previously, like similar to the Greek idea of apotheosis, that, and I guess to kind of clarify what that means, because I've heard certain apologists like J.P. Holding on the Tectonics website kind of mock that
My
idea.
favorite.
Right. Yeah, he's kind of infamous around the interwebs, but he kind of mocked that idea of like a spiritual resurrection, because in his Christian thinking he couldn't quite get that. Like, how is a spirit resurrecting if it doesn't have a body? What the hell is a spiritual resurrection? In those views, spirit, as we might think of it, was just disembodied consciousness, and to use it in modern terms, you still had to have a vehicle for that consciousness to interact with its environment. And so you kind of had to develop or undergo magical rituals or whatever have you, whatever culture you were participating in. You had to do some kind of process to develop this ethereal, non-corporeal replication of your earthly body for your disembodied consciousness to kind of transfer into and then be able to interact with its environment. And as far as I understand it, that's sort of similar to what the Essene belief was, in that they didn't believe that a physical resurrection was necessary, that you could achieve some sort of like spiritualized afterlife. And I think that's what descended down into what we find in the authentic epistles of Paul. You talk about like in Corinthians, where he says like, you're gonna leave this physical body behind, and it's gonna dissolve, and then you have to reap a spiritual body in the stars.
Nice. That's actually a fascinating area of study, is where was it that the Jews themselves, got the idea of resurrection? Where did they get this? And I happen to think that it's kind of an amalgamation of Egyptian, Canaanite, and Zoroastrian views. That might run afoul of Occam's razor, but I don't know. I can't help it. I don't know. I think we're branching off into philosophy here. I think Occam's razor is better applied to the sciences than it is to history, because human history is it's very variegated and complex. But I think we talked before, Derek, about John Day's book, Yahweh and the Gods and Goddesses of Canaan, where he discusses the impact of the Baal cult on the ancient Israelites, and how that might have served as an inspiration for the idea of metaphorical resurrection in the Old Testament, such as in Isaiah 26 and so forth. But I tend to see some Osirian concepts there as well. You discuss on your blog, Neal, Hosea, I think it's Hosea chapter 6, verse 2, if I'm not mistaken, might have something of an Osirian context. And I happen to think that of Ezekiel 37 too, with the rejoining of the dry bones in the valley. But I don't know. There seems to be something something oral. I think there's some more Zoroastrian in it. I'm done talking. Don't do crack.
Glossolalia. He's spitting by the Holy Spirit. Yeah. I think I can agree with that. I've got to admit, I know almost zilch about Zoroastrianism. Again, I just have an armchair knowledge of that from what I hear from persons like yourself, Robert Price, or whoever else. A little bit more well-read on the Baal cycle. And I can definitely agree with that, especially since you can see the heavy influence that Baal had on the Israelites. It's mentioned in the Bible. And I think that's actually something that's lost in English translation of the Bible, where everything in the Old Testament either gets labeled God or Lord, when if you left it in its original tongue, what you'd find is an assortment of different gods that are in many linguistic contexts referred to distinctively from each other, and not just different names for the same God. One of those names being Baal. Now I understand, I get it, because I know some Christians are going to retort, Baal is just a generic term, it just means Lord or whatever. But I mean, when you read it in context, you can kind of tell, oh no, something's going on here. On top of that, these names of God being a generic title can be said for almost all of them. Adonai was a generic title. El, of course, was a generic name. Nevertheless, we all still know who they're talking about in the Old Testament when they mention these names. So yeah, there's actually a lot of verses when read in their original Hebrew that refer to what we would call, I guess, Yahweh as Baal. Like, no two ways about it. I definitely do think, definitely the Osiris cult in Egypt had a heavy influence on the idea of physical resurrection integrating into Judaism. The first place I start to see it, and just reading the Old Testament as it's laying out to us, is in Genesis during the story of Joseph. It's pretty clear that Joseph is mummified. While I don't think it explicitly says that in Revelation, when it talks about how Joseph's body had to be embalmed for 70 days, that's literally right out of the mummification process. Like all ancient Egyptians who were mummified, it was a 70-day process. And then also it was the request of Jacob, I think it was, when Joseph brought Jacob and the rest of the family into Egypt. Jacob said, please, when I die, take my corpse back to the homeland and bury me there with my ancestors. That was a very important thing. That is also reflective of ancient Egyptian thinking, that, you know, you had to be buried with your ancestors and with your descendants and with your pets and your servants. You all had to be buried in the same kind of tomb sanctuary, so that when you went to the afterlife, you all went together and you all kind of resumed the same functions and roles you had here in the world of the living. And that's, yeah, so there you can begin to see the Egyptian afterlife thinking kind of weaving its way into ancient Judaism.
Interesting. Yeah, sorry, my kid was coming in here trying to get the spotlight, man, you know. No, this is, I love this stuff, and trying to understand why they would bury or mummify has always made me think, why are they trying to preserve the body? It wouldn't make any sense to me why you would preserve a physical body. And then Jews were known for preserving the physical body, but then the Greeks come on the scene and they want to, you know, they want to burn the physical body. They literally, we practice this all the time. Cremation's cheaper than burying a body in the grave. And I don't think people really ask, you know, many questions. Why are we burying them 6 feet deep? You know, we don't really ask those type of things, but not trying to rabbit trail. This idea of resurrection, I think, is super important. Trying to understand why the church still exists. To me, it's my opinion. There's an apocalyptic time frame in which everything is supposed to happen. I mean, it was all supposed to end. At the very beginning, at the New Testament, there's such an immediate context. Something had to happen. And if they did think it was the physical resurrection that was supposed to happen, but it didn't, now you know why the church is still going. They're waiting for something that will never happen. And that might be why it's still alive and running today. Now, if they thought it was spiritual or something, like, I don't think Paul's ideas of resurrection ultimately have survived. I think an orthodoxy whitewash of Paul's version is what we see. And it was so bad, even in the Protestant times, that Wycliffe, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Wycliffe, the Roman Catholic Church was so angry by his translation of the Bible, they took his bones, uncovered him from the grave, burned his bones into, literally they ground his bones down and then burnt the remainder of the bones to ashes and then spread them in the water. And then there's this like little floating saying the Protestant said is it's okay because Wycliffe's bones covered the entire earth now, or something like crazy, you know what I'm saying? But anyway, I just thought maybe that was something to touch on. Do you guys have any other areas you want to touch on?
Well, I just wanted to say, you know, with what we've been diving into, is this is kind of the central problem that I have with critics of these ideas, like Litwa and others, where they do, again, they try to seal these cultures off one another and act as though, you know, ancient Egypt, with regard to Palestine, would have been this completely just alien culture, altogether different cultural milieu, that the kinds of things that they practice and believe would have been unheard of to Jews, especially those at the beginning of the Common Era. And I have a big problem with that. For one thing, you see the long constancy of these myths in ancient Egypt, and the soteriological aspect of the Osirian cult, you know, running all the way on up through to the Greco-Roman period. It didn't go anywhere, as Neal can surely attest. SGF Brandon does a great job kind of tracking it down the centuries. You know, it didn't change much, really. And And then, of course, you have the proximity of Palestine to ancient Egypt. That's kind of a given. You have the fact that ancient Egypt ruled Canaan from the 16th to 11th centuries BC. And of course, you do have all of these archaeological artifacts and so forth from ancient Egypt. They're in Palestine. It looks to me as though they had a profound impact on the wider Mediterranean world. And I think it's all too easy for the classicists and those who strictly study the Greco-Roman world to dismiss this other culture because it's just something that's not under their microscope that often. I don't know. What do you think about that, Neal?
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty much an unbroken continuity from the Old Kingdom period right on down to the Roman era. Yeah, and Palestine was at the crossroads of several how would you say it? Trading routes throughout the Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. It seems to me very naive to try and paint that kind of portrait of Palestine as being kind of closed off. In fact, one of the very reasons that in the Old Testament you constantly find the Jews being taken into captivity is for that very reason. It's like at the junction point of other territories, other greater kingdoms trying to go to war with each other and take each other over. They're kind of literally caught in the crossroads.
Fuckers again.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, clearly they weren't sealed off. Otherwise, that wouldn't have kept happening. As even their own Bible says, like, you guys keep getting taken into captivity, and Yahweh has to keep rescuing you from them. If they were as sealed off as Christians would like to try and have us believe, that wouldn't have happened. And of course, with that conquest, that repeated conquest of Palestine comes, the cultural influence, often mandatory. Again, as we read in the Book of Maccabees, the reason that the Jews at that time started to incorporate the worship of Dionysus into their own religion was the first stage of it was that it was mandatory. It was Antiochus Epiphanes, was it at the time, who had made it a decree that the Jews had to participate in that festival, and where worship of both Dionysus and Zeus were taking place, and on the holy grounds where the temple of Yahweh was. But a generation or two later, those ruling elites were taken out of power, and by the time we get to the first century, where Jesus and the apostles allegedly did their whole shtick, we find testimony from Plutarch and other writers at the time that worship of Dionysus was still being practiced by Jews in Palestine. So the Maccabees were like what, 2nd century BC, I think. And then we find that they're still doing that of their own free will, no longer under duress of the ruling powers, but of their own free will, still practicing the worship of Dionysus in around 100 CE, I think was when Plutarch was writing. Then, clearly, somewhere in the middle there was Jesus and the apostles. You can't tell me there wasn't some influence there.
Neal, we discussed the mystery religions last week, and we talked about that, the soteriology involved, whereby there is this sort of mystic parallelism between the god and the devotee, that as the god undergoes some kind of death and resurrection or rebirth or victory, what have you, so does the initiate into the cult by experiencing, undergoing a ritual, becoming initiated, and undergoing something, similar to the fate of the risen God. Do you think that the Osirian cult was more or less the prototype for all of the Greco-Roman cults to follow, or do you think that they arose, organically and kind of flowed together? Or what's your thoughts on that?
This is where that's a fascinating question. I'm actually really glad you asked that, because this is where I have some conflicting thoughts that I'm still trying to work out myself. I do think ultimately, Osiris served as the prototype for the major cults that we often group under that umbrella of mystery cult religions with a dying and rising god, where the initiate identifies with the god in order to achieve like fate to the god. Dionysus, Adonis status, the whole shtick. Yeah, I do think that perhaps there were some cults that perhaps arose organically and had some overlapping concepts, and then when they came into contact with the Syrian religion or perhaps the Dionysus religion and whatnot, they're like, oh, this is so similar to ours, let's just blend them. Yeah, I do think that happened. And what I think is behind, this is just my personal opinion from this point forward, what I think is ultimately behind all of that, these cultures that arise organically having very similar, as you said, like prototype or template to the Osiris mythos, is what I guess is often described by anthropologists as shamanic initiation, which you can still see that reflected in a lot of third world cultures today, or cultures that you might find like way out in the Amazon or way out in the the Congo of Africa or whatnot, where they still practice where they still have a tribal kind of society, and there's still a witch doctor who has to act as the go-between between this world and quote the spirit world. The way they describe what they experienced during their shamanic initiation rituals. And now that some of those rituals have been opened to Westerners, such as I'm sure you guys have heard about how they do ayahuasca sessions down in Peru. A lot of Westerners, Americans, and Europeans and stuff who go down there and take the ayahuasca. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them do report experiences that match that same template of the Osiris mythos. And the reason I'm so on board with that kind of thinking is an anecdotal experience. I myself I haven't taken ayahuasca, but the active chemical in it, so they say, is DMT, and I have taken that, and I have experienced something it basically checks all the points on the list of the Osiris mythos, where you experience merging with this, for lack of a better description, divine character, or this character that you see, induced under this, altered state of consciousness. You experience first merging with it, then you experience being shattered or broken into pieces or dismembered somehow, and then you experience being reconstituted, but with a transfigured form, so to speak. And then you kind of undergo this, I guess you could say apotheosis or divinization or resurrection of some sort, for lack of a better term, but it fits that same pattern. We're like, okay, you merge with this character, you are dismembered, you're reconstituted, and then you're transformed into something greater. It's basically that same Assyrian template.
I got to comment on this before you leave this conversation here, because I've been asking this question to many people. I even did this recently. I can't help it. Sometimes I have to say things even when the show's about something else. But in this one, this fits the context quite well. I interviewed in the last show I did Cameron Riley for the movie he just did, Marketing the Messiah. And I said, look, dying and rising agricultural deities, okay, it's not that far-fetched, I think, to suggest that the sacrament of Jesus is agricultural sacrament of the being divine with the God or gods. And you are then participating in the Apotheosis ceremony with the divine. One might be beer, one might be wine, whatever. But I have, and I'm not trying to get too far off into the fringe type ideas that you are speculating here, and I think there could be something there. And on the Historicity with Dr. Carrier, his argumentation is Paul's crazy. He's batshit nuts. He just loses his mind and has this light experience. But it's my experience as well. And I never did DMT and I never did ayahuasca, but I did take mushrooms, golden cap mushrooms. I have tried other things that have hallucinogenic principles and properties, or whatever you want to call it. And I didn't have that same experience, but I can easily see the world that I saw through it. Okay. It changed. There's not a way, you can't put it in words. There's not a description. You only can experience it. There is no way to define this. Once you have experienced it, you understand things only through that world, by the way, in a way that is not descriptive, other than possibly like a magical place. It's a magical world. And so I wondered if the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus that we find in the Gospels, yes, I'm going to go so far as to say the Gospels, where they go, that's the historical. Okay, what if this is a Homeric, type of a funny cartoon, so to speak, of something that is a ceremonial mystery school thing. And I asked a leading scholar in the Mormon world, John Knight Lunwall. He believes in the physical resurrection of Jesus, right? Which you know what that includes. And I said, John, you've blown my mind with Astro Theology. You've blown my mind on seeing when Jesus walks on water. There's a parallel here to the Orion in the sky, and he explained and did a 3-hour section on a video showing this is Orion. Jesus walking is this, that. I said, John, is that not what's going on with the death, burial, and resurrection? Is there not some type of celestial thing? And he goes, Derek, I'll grant you that it's possible. And then that was it. We were off the conversation, but I was like, yes, at least you said. And he thinks that where I was going with it made a lot of sense. So I'm sorry for taking us 5 minutes off the path for a second. I wanted us to get there for a second, just sit there and think, what if mystery school is a better explanation than the milieu of Judaism?
I also just want to say, kids, don't do drugs.
Of course.
You're not advocating that?
The views expressed by Neal Boswell here do not reflect those of MythVision.
Not at all. Right now? No, I'm not.
No, definitely. Thank you for adding that clarification. But also, going back to what Derek had just said, I'm so glad you brought that back around to Orion, because in the Egyptian Osirian cult, his celestial counterpart, or his constellation that symbolized him, was Orion. They called it Sa, but Orion symbolized Osiris, and then Sirius represented Isis. And the reason for that is because that's how they delineated their year and their agricultural cycles. Orion was the first constellation to have its heliacal setting, where it can no longer be seen above the horizon for about, I think, 72 days during the late spring to early autumn. And then shortly thereafter, so goes Sirius, and then the rest of the stars follow. And then, 72 days later, he appears, above the horizon again, and that's, quote, his, resurrection. Yeah, and that was actually an in-game, so to speak, of the whole of Syrian Soteriology, as we can say, especially as it's laid out in certain texts like the Pyramid text. There's several spells in there that really want to drive that point home of you becoming Osiris, and then you say, I may ascend to Orion like Osiris, and I may live there and reign as king in heaven like Osiris. I will reign from Orion with Isis at my side on her star, Sirius, or Sophis as they called it. Yeah, and so for you to mention the water walking myth, we'll have to talk more about that some of the time. I'm interested to hear how.
This is just the first, man. We've got a lot more, to do for real.
I can't help too but think of Ephesians, where Paul declares, when God raised us with Christ and seated us with Him on the throne in heaven. It's that same kind of, it's sort of like resurrection and apotheosis, kind of all in one. That when you're raised, you are raised into the heavens and then seated upon the throne, that you yourself become a God in that case, and thus immortal.
Right. Even in the Gospels, Jesus quotes that verse from the Old Testament where he says, "It's not written in your law, I have said you are gods." And if it's okay for the Old Testament to say you are gods, why do you get mad at me for saying I'm the Son of God, Right. So even there, you kind of have this little wink and nod, like, hey, one day we're gonna be gods.
That makes me think too, with the shamanistic stuff in light of this, John the Baptist fits a strange description of eating wild locusts and honey. Like, what are they trying to say? Your diet is strictly just, I guess, but it makes me kind of wonder, he's leading a pack of people out in the wilderness. There are multiple interpretations. I understand. Theodus could have been this guy in history. Theodus had been beheaded. The Romans came after him. He said he was going to split the Jordan River. Of course, that didn't happen. But it makes me think of the practice of baptism, because the entire water baptism initiation is introduced by this guy named John the Baptist. And, I don't know about you, but maybe they were this superstitious that if you were out in the wilderness and I went to you and you were saying things that were kind of in the range of my kind of thoughts, and you said, hey, I'm going to dunk you underwater, just say a few words, and you're going to come up and you're going to be resurrected. Let's just say like the Gnostics kind of have a resurrection at baptism concept. I kind of wonder if there was an initiatory process where it's like, all right, take this. All right, now we're going to take you and dunk you. You're going to experience, the dove's going to come out of heaven, baby. You know what I'm saying? And I don't know. I'm reading into this probably, but it just is pure speculation. Just an interesting thought in the mystery school angle.
Well, as you said, we find from some of the heresiologists like Irenaeus that there were schools of Gnosticism that had that view about the baptism of Jesus. They say there's some, the way Irenaeus presents it is like there's some schools of Gnosticism that don't believe that Jesus, the human being Jesus, was literally the Son of God, but they had the adoptionist view, which is that Jesus became the Christ, or he became the Son of God at the moment of his baptism, when the Spirit of God as the dove came and dwelt inside of him. Again, like you said, kind of like this initiatory process. As far as what the cult of John the Baptist may or may not have been taking to accentuate that experience back in the day, I don't know. But I do know there is a fair amount of, I guess you could say, circumstantial evidence that the earliest churches of Christianity were indulging in mushroom caps. We find that in the iconography of our earliest, our oldest extant churches have iconography of the Eucharist being served, and instead of bread wafers, it's actually mushroom caps that are being handed around in the basket. So it's like, okay, I mean, yeah, if you take up mushrooms, you'll probably see Jesus or become one with him or whatnot. I definitely think there was something else going on.
There's probably something there. Derek, I know you, I can read your mind. It's almost like I took a hallucinogen. Derek wants us to tackle David Whitla here, okay? He wants us to deal with this guy, which, by the way, I can't wait to read his book because he's brilliant. He really is. He just came at the mythicist sideways, especially Dr. Carrier. And if you've read Dr. Carrier's response, a lot of emotion in there, man. And I'm not trying to be funny. I mean, there was a lot of emotion. I think Dr. Carrier feels that he's strawmanned left and right. He's a one-man army in this field. In a lot of ways, him and Dr. Price aren't like teaming up to come into this field. They both have their own avenues, and Carrier's like a standalone, and there's like 8 or 9, 10, 20 people constantly attacking him for his mythicism. What do you think about that? I mean, he goes so far in saying there are these connections, but then, like you said, Derek, he does a 180. So I guess sticking to the heart of this episode, I'd like for us to just kind of tackle that a little more. Do you not see there's good reason to say, hey, this guy may not even have existed? And where does Whitla, and I haven't read his book, where does he draw that line? I mean, he sounds like he sees parallels, but is he similar to Dennis MacDonald, where Dr. MacDonald says, oh, look, the Gospels, the Synoptics are obviously mimetic criticism shows they're borrowing from the Homeric epics and the Odyssey. He wrote his book, The Dionysian Gospel, which he shows the Gospel of John. And, you could show where they took the literary tropes from and borrowed some of the stuff, not only from the Old Testament, from Greek stories. Where do you draw the line? And Dennis goes, that doesn't mean he didn't exist. So it's like, well, what does show that he exists then, since you're already assuming he does? Where do we draw the line where we're not, where we make sense? We're not just out here swinging bats at people. We're legitimately like, show me who he is then, if he does. And if not, at least speculate and say there could have been, but we're not sure. I don't know. Take it off, brother. I know you want to talk more about that.
Well, I've just noticed this oddity to where, like I said, in Isis Deuce, Litwa has no problem whatsoever discussing religious syncretism and the parallels between Christ and those such as Heracles, Romulus, and Asclepius. But when we're addressing mythicism, suddenly all of that kind of talk is off the table. You see Bart Ehrman do this also. I think it was his introduction to the New Testament, where he mentioned that the mystery religions with their dying and rising gods are a good place for reflection. Is this, quite possibly something that that had an influence and impact on Christianity? But when we're discussing mythicism and did Jesus exist, oh no, no, sir. That stuff is off the table. So it's just this, if we're attacking mythicism, then we have to attack everything associated with it. And if comparative religion, pagan parallels is part of that package, well, now we've got to take it down rather than assert it. And it's just something I've noticed, and it seems pretty. I don't understand the hypocrisy. It's and yet it's also kind of deliciously ironic. But I myself, as I've said, I'm agnostic with regard to the historicity of Jesus. I don't know. Maybe there was a guy in that. If I'm being honest, I know I could be crucified for saying this, but I kind of don't care as it regards my atheism. It doesn't make much of a difference to me. But at the same time, I'm not saying that it is therefore insignificant. I obviously understand why people are fascinated with the topic. I have been as well, but there comes a point for me where it's just like, you know what? You can have him, But I don't know. Neal, I guess I'd like to ask you, what's your take on the historicity of Jesus? I think I understand you to be a mythicist, and if you can crack that open as to why that is, is it because, some would say that, well, Jesus, there was a historical God, but he was simply deified along the lines of these popular myths and popular legends. But others, of course, say, I don't think there even was a guy. What's your take, Neal?
I suppose I'm really pressed on the matter. I have to likewise admit to being an agnostic on the situation, but with a probably 90% to 10% leaning towards he didn't exist. And like you said, and even if there was a historical man at the root of it, I think the point is moot as far as the mythicist position and what we're trying to bring forward. Where it's mostly about the character as portrayed in the New Testament is clearly, in my opinion, 100% fictional. Jesus was a pretty common name back in the day. You could have, picked anyone out as a, here's the historical root of it. I've often heard the analogy being to an onion. It doesn't matter how many layers you peel back on an onion, there's no core to it. So, a hodgepodge of 20 different historical people is at the end of the day, nobody at all. To steal a quote from Gerald Massey. I've noticed this special.
If you get this answer wrong, you're going to hell, just so you know.
I've been to hell, actually, the biblical hell. It's not a bad place. I think it's Gehenna in the New Testament. Yeah, I've been there. I've taken a trip to Israel and I've been to Gehenna. So I've been to hell, and made it out on the other side. But anyway, back to the topic at hand. I've noticed this special pleading with the historicity of Jesus when compared to basically anything else in the New Testament being deconstructed from a purely secular point of view. It's okay, we'll allow that up to the point of the human being himself actually existing. Then we have to hop off this train and say, oh, that's for the fringe, that's for the crazies. In my observation, what really made mythicism, and especially in regards to comparative mythology, that route of it, what really made that polarizing in the way that Derreck just laid it out was with Zeitgeist, honestly, with the Zeitgeist film back in 2007. It was before then, and that was when streaming videos as a social media was still kind of in its infancy. So before then, on the internet, in discussion forums and the other more popular mediums through which we've been communicating on the internet, you could actually openly discuss the hypothesis of mythicism and perhaps Jesus didn't really exist at all and was fictional with people who were scholars, people who were, in universities working towards their credentials, working towards a graduate degree in a relevant field like classics or Egyptology, whatever. You could openly discuss this with other atheists and skeptics and it not be derided as some fringe theory or oh, that's just crazy, nobody endorses that. Not to say that everyone you talked with agreed with you, but it was like, it was considered a viewpoint worthy of consideration as much as any other viewpoint. Like, okay, you're a historicist, I'm a mythicist. Oh, okay, hey, buddy. It was, you know, we were all regarded as peers. When Zeitgeist came out, while I think at the end of the day, the point it was trying to make is correct, the way it went about it included many errors that I think have been thoroughly debunked on both sides. And that's a shame, because even to this day, over a decade later, it still stands out as like the quintessential, like, here is what mythicists believe kind of package that is presented. And yeah, you know, because one of the priorities, I guess you could say, of not so much atheists, but skeptical-minded people in general, one of our prerogatives is to, again, to be skeptical and to want to strive for factual accuracy. Then yeah, once the errors of Zeitgeist came out, by and large, the internet atheist community had to distance themselves from it. But as an unfortunate consequence of that, they distanced themselves from mythicism in general, and especially the comparative mythology side of it. And that's when you started seeing not just, you know, apologists like JP Holding jumping on the internet saying, oh, here's how Zeitgeist is full of shit. You started seeing a lot of atheists doing that. Here's how Zeitgeist is full of shit. And unfortunately, that's caused people, and I'm sure Derek well knows, that's caused people like us to kind of be put into that helm with Zeitgeist. Like, oh, it's just another Peter Joseph, and, you know, forget what he has to say. And go ahead.
I was gonna say, it makes our job that much harder.
Yes.
I'm with you 100%. In fact, I wish there was a documentary, the same, I don't know, that movie grabbed me. So like when I was a Christian, I was open-minded, of course, toward the end, I saw it and I was like, literally, I was like, are you kidding me? Like that's like, do not open this door. This is the door you're not supposed to open as a Christian. And I opened it. And when I saw it, it blew my mind. Now, I didn't know sources. I didn't know how accurate all of it was. I didn't even need to know that all the details were accurate. To know the gist that was being presented felt right. It felt like, you know, I guess it was more of a emotional and a subjective experience that I had to get over for me as a Christian was, is my Jesus really the one and only? And when I hurdled that emotional trauma, it was a trauma. I felt like a pain in my stomach while I watched these men describe, did you know this is celestial? Did you know, all this different stuff? And it really blew my mind. Then I found out later, because I didn't even necessarily know anything. I just went, whoa, dude, this is bigger. It planted a seed and opened up my mind a little. Then I started looking at the details. I started going, oh, okay. Horus, December 24th, like they do, everything was identical, and I don't have the sources, but that was the problem. Now you have to fight that. I wish someone produced a documentary from the atheist side saying, here's what was right and here's what was wrong about this movie. That would be great.
I know who you can talk to about that. That guy, that one right there. Yeah, Boswell covers that. Take it away, man. Neal, tell him. Tell us.
Yeah, no, definitely. What you just described, that effect of Zeitgeist, is what I do appreciate about it, which is why I'm not going to totally, I never have completely jumped off the train and say, it's an unnecessary piece of shit. It was the initial catalyst for a lot of people. And for that, I am grateful for it, but it could have been a lot better. And yeah, it's, I think we are overdue in the community for a revision of that, or a, maybe a pop-up video, VH1 style. Here's where Zeitgeist got it wrong, we got it right. Yeah, definitely. I think that could be a worthwhile project. I don't know. Right now, I'd be hard pressed to find the time for it, but yeah, definitely, I would be.
You'll make the time.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, we'll make the time.
That would be a good idea, is to do a series where we play the clip, and we pause it, and we comment about the material, and you can go in depth, piece at a time, because honestly, it's going to take funding if we were going to do something proper. And I wish we did. I mean, maybe funding will come, but like Cameron Riley, who just did Marketing the Messiah, someone who had the money came out of nowhere and said, hey, I want you to do something on the Roman Caesar and Jesus, JC, and parallels. And he's like, there's not that much there to create a good documentary on. So he said, I do have an idea. And that's when he came up with Marketing the Messiah, the movie we have. If someone could produce the income and we had the graphic, someone who could pull up graphics, do some nice footage, and interview some scholars in this field that support the idea. And then in the documentary, just so that they know it's not just a whole one-way street, all supporters of the theory, have the critics who don't agree, like maybe David Litwa or other people who will go, oh, well, even Dr. Ehrman, have them say, no, listen, they're wrong because it's in the milieu, and then have the other scholars like Dr. Price piggyback on that and go in and say, look here, okay, really? What do you do with this? What do you do with that? How do you answer this? And really give a fair, it'll be more leaning in this direction of what we're supporting, but it'll allow the critics to have a voice in the documentary. So if someone watches it, they're not going to go, hey, this is bogus. No, nice try, buddy. Because I'm with you. There was a lot of truth in what was presented, in my opinion. I just think that we're due for an update that's more accurate and that's going to hammer down allowing both voices in one documentary, not just a one-way street. I think it'd be better. Yeah, true. And there is a new generation that's coming of age now who is not familiar with Zeitgeist. I mean, we take it for granted because, we've been around long enough to know of it, but I'm starting to find that people who were children at the time that it came out, now they're becoming adults and they haven't been exposed to that yet. And so, yeah, I think it's time to present the material more accurately to this new generation and see if we can have that same effect that Zeitgeist should have had. Absolutely.
Now, Neal, Derreck's experience was very similar to mine. I first came across Zeitgeist, didn't know anything about this stuff. It had a major impact. And again, this pretty much the same process. I went about, I actually read a lot of JP Holding on his site Tectonics, and I saw a lot of this stuff get debunked. But somehow in the process, I came across Price and counter apologetics, and eventually, was able to dig up reputable scholarship and legitimate primary sources to kind of get at the real deal. But it sounds like you knew a lot about this stuff before Zeitgeist ever even came out. How did you come across this stuff, and what is it that has driven you? Because, I mean, I cover this stuff pretty in depth, but you blow me the frick away. What drives that? What is it that gives you such an incredible handle on this? There's something driving that, and I'm curious to know what.
Yes, it's called obsessive compulsive disorder.
Hey! I thought you might. No one, brother. It does.
Right. Yeah, definitely. There's definitely some element of that going on. I think guys like us we geek out about this stuff a little too much, perhaps. But
look how neat his room is, for God's sake.
To answer your question in the way you asked it, yeah, it's an extension from what I talked about in the intro, in that throughout my religious life, I always had that curiosity of just, I guess, an existential crisis, just figuring out the why of it all, just religion in itself. Even though I wholeheartedly believed the Protestant Christian worldview, that wasn't enough to satiate my, I guess, existential anxiety, so to speak. It still doesn't tell me why. Why does God want me to do this? Blah, blah, blah. And so that initial drive is what led me to leave the Baptist denomination for Seventh-day Adventism. And then again, it was in the course of me, I wasn't a Seventh-day Adventist for very long, only a couple of years. And it was in the course of trying to integrate into that culture. They introduced me to the idea of comparative mythology, but under the way they presented it was like, okay, here's all the things that are pagan about Roman Catholicism. We've got the real version of Christianity. They've got this, heretical version that's, corrupted with all this paganism. And they did a pretty good job of that. Like, they'll show you, like, here's the, mantra beads of Hinduism, and here's the rosary beads of Catholicism. See, you see the, they have 108, and this one has 52, which is half of 108. Like that, they present you enough to pique your curiosity, but then they stop just short of where it incriminates anything that is considered canonical in the Protestant theology. They'll stop shy of anything that is a pagan parallel of something directly in the Gospels or directly in the epistles, such as death and resurrection. They'll tell you, all day long, like, oh yeah, the Pope's mitre is comparable to like the Hajet crown of Osiris, but they won't ever tell you that, hey, and did you know that Osiris was buried and rose from the dead 3 days later? Very similar to Jesus. The way I came across that aspect of it was I was researching this very topic. This was back in 2002, I think. I was working at a Christian bookstore at the time, and I was so, much to probably kind of incriminating myself by admitting this, but while I should have been working, I just kind of logged into the internet from the work computer there at the desk, and was just Googling, researching questions I'd had about this material, kind of basically fact checking, like seeing how accurate it was. Okay, is this Roman Catholic custom really based in pagan mythology and stuff? And the internet back then was not what it is now. And I stumbled upon one of those lists I'm sure you've all seen, like, hey, did you know that? And it was about Mithras. Hey, did you know Mithras ticks all the boxes? He had 12 disciples. He was crucified. He got married. And again, a lot of those things on that list were inaccurate. And I'm a little ashamed to say this, but the website it was hosted on was davidike.com.
Oh!
Exactly. That was my zeitgeist.
Shut it down.
All right. My zeitgeist was David Icke. Now, needless to say, for obvious reasons, I never really jumped on the David Icke train. It didn't take much digging through that website to say, oh, well, this guy's batshit crazy. But what I read on that page about Mithras had very much the same emotional response as what Derek described earlier when he first watched Zeitgeist. You said that emotional trauma. Like, I just remember as I'm reading this, and even just considering, even though I didn't believe it, just considering the possibility that it was true, I just remember feeling this intense like heat and like sinking feeling inside. It was very like, whoa, what is this? The possibility that there was no Jesus, the possibility that my religion is wrong, like, whoo, and it was making me like literally like tremble. And I guess that trauma made it stick in my brain enough to, like you said, be this like driving force of like, no, I got to figure this out. I got to know for certain. I got to fact check all this shit and find out what's really at the heart of the matter here.
One of those things that blew me away, guys, was when I watched the Zeitgeist and it got through the parallels between other gods. That didn't shock me, even though I was like, whoa, it did take away the idea that this is unique and authentic. In a way, that was a little shocking, but I think what I could grab a hold of the most, because I've never read the Osiris story, the Mithras story, the Dionysus, I didn't know those gods. Even to this day, I talk names of gods that I don't know thoroughly from the source material, which is bad on me, but I mean, I'm learning, right? I don't claim to know it all here. I'm just here to learn, and I'm going to figure out more as time goes. But when it got to explaining things on the celestial, that's what made the most sense to me. The agricultural and celestial made the most sense to me, because I looked at nature and I saw the world around us make sense in this story. Not in this literal Jewish guy who was a carpenter who ran the streets of Judaism, causing hell for the Romans or possibly for the Jews. And, that was what I always thought. But then when I heard them talk about how in the spring, and it gave me this continual annual cycle, and it was describing the sun, the light of the world, and it just, then I was going to reading these phrases in John that I couldn't let go of in different places, that, he's the light of the world. The ideas of him being the bright and morning star, just basic stuff. Like, what? He's the bright and morning star. What the heck? Why would you even say that about a guy? oh, he's just a twinkle, twinkle little star. No, like this guy is the bright and morning star. And then you'll read Revelation and you go, what is going on with this book? So I think the things I could connect to more wasn't just the parallels to other gods, even though some of that stuff you said is factual and some of it's not. It was that I looked outside and realized in spring, that's when green starts to come back. That's when there's fertility. That's why we practice, bunnies out there laying eggs. And that's when Jesus rises from the dead. And when I started seeing those practices and things that we commonly understood, that's what I connected with the most. And that helped me, I think, was going, this is the world around us told in a great story. And there may be facts in reality in the Gospels of the destruction of the temple, people who existed, Pontius Pilate, real people, real places, real things, possibly. And some of these people may not be real, like Judas Iscariot. So when people argue John the Baptist existed, why didn't Jesus? Well, Judas Iscariot existed, or he didn't, or he may not. So who did and who didn't isn't, we can do that all day long. But I connected to that theme, and then I found more and more reason to look into numbers. Numbers started to get me lost. You mentioned earlier 72. And I just remember 72. Whoa, that digs deep into Luke 10 and going into the Old Testament, and then looking at, well, the way they came up with the cycle of a year calendar, and how there were 5 cycles of 72 that they would come up with. There was the 5 remaining days, and just there's so much, man, that really you never get told, is made me start to look outside of the box that I was in. And that was what got me. That drive was, they're not going to tell me this at church. And it started realizing there's a reason that they don't know this information and they're not willing to discuss it. It broadens the scope of anyone who's willing to really look.
Mm-hmm. And I find that to be such a shame that, churchgoers of today don't want to go down that route of exploring the stellar connection to their religion, because that aspect of it doesn't require them discarding anything about their faith or any of their core theological tenets, because the Bible itself often you pointed out some of the more subtle clues, like Jesus being the light of the world and talking about there being 12 hours in a day and, hey, I've got 12 disciples. That's some of the more subtle, or you might even dare say like cryptic stuff. But especially more so in the Old Testament, it's a lot more overt. Right in Genesis, when God creates the stars, he says, I give these to you for signs to follow the seasons and to chart your location and things like that, to be a guiding system, is why I created the stars. Now we know scientifically, factually, that's bullshit. But the point being that for a Christian, if you take the Bible literally, God is telling you to look at the stars and observe patterns between the stars and what's going on in the world around you, like you said, to find the correlation. Now, not to go so far as to endorse astrology, which also, again, the Bible explicitly condemns. So we're all on the same page in that regard. But that can open up a whole new area of appreciation and wonder and beauty for your culture as a Christian, is to understand how star patterns were integrated into the stories in the Bible.
Price mentioned that he talked about how, because he continued to attend church for some time, even after he relinquished his faith. And for him, once he was partaking of the Eucharistic bread and wine, it was that much cooler to him, because of the fact that he realized that had such a long history from time immemorial in its manifestation as a mystery, and partaking of the the energy of the God who represented the grain or the wine or the grape or whatever. It was that much more profound an experience for him after that. So,
Well, gentlemen, what do you think about wrapping this up for round 1? And we schedule another, because there's too much that we can cover when it comes to this topic. I'm with you guys. I think that there's they're going to sell themselves short if they don't realize how much Hellenization really opened the door to just like the freedom of thought between cultures. And there are groups who read this New Testament who want to demand, and I'm not just talking about these guys, I'm talking about there are groups in which that I'm acquainted with, which are not, you know, in the scholars realm, called Israel only, for example. It's all biological descendants of Abraham only. Even Paul's Gentiles, according to them, were biological descendants of Abraham. And they do a lot of different things on why they interpret that. I'll leave that for another discussion. However, there isn't this back and forth. They don't see why. They see why Jews would use Hellenistic ideas. They don't see why the Jewish religion would also have its impact on the world around them. And that is another key point here. I love what you guys are talking about here, because it then allows the door for Dionysus, the Osiris rituals, the other practices to enter the realm of Judaism. And I was going to mention this earlier, Russell Gamirkin. If you've not read his book, Neal and Derek, you guys should really check it out. I just recently read it, called Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible. And his thesis is, and what he does is he takes one of the most boring things you can do and actually makes it quite interesting. The laws, like all the laws, and he goes extensively in detail, paralleling them to the ancient Near Eastern cultures and theirs, from the Hammurabi Code, the Hittites, the Athenian and the Greek laws, et cetera, et cetera. And he shows that there's more of a comparison to the Athenian Greek laws and the Hebrew Bible's laws in the Constitution of the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew Old Testament to Plato's laws and the Athenian Greek laws than it does to the Hammurabi or ancient Near Eastern in many cases. Very few areas does it differ, and it supports more of the ancient Near Eastern interpretation over against the Greek and the Plato interpretation. And Plato, you know, one of the things he does that's powerful, this comes down to empirical evidence, right? We want to be about evidence as much as possible. His thesis is minimalism. He believes that we've started with late dates because the book seems late. It talks late. It acts late. It sounds late in many ways. And he says the problem is we got to go with what we know and what we have of evidence. And he dates it back to 270 BC when they claimed that they wanted a translation of the Hebrew Bible. And that's when they translated it into Greek. He says this is when they invented, this is when they created the Constitution for the Hebrew people. And he goes to lay out the evidence by going to their sources in the Alexandrian library, Manetho and Berosus. And Manetho, I believe, was the Persian the Egyptian source, and Berosus is the Babylonian. So you got to ask yourself, why did Abraham come from Ur of Chaldees? Well, you're going to find out if you read the book. And anyway, I just thought it was interesting to say that, because if the Hebrew Bible was created in the Hellenistic era, all right, not saying they didn't pull from older sources, not saying they didn't incorporate concepts that they liked, even if it was a little different from the Greeks. Predominantly, they borrowed Athenian and Platonic laws and gave it their own spin for their own constitution. If he's correct, this blows the whole door open to, well, only one-way street. No, my friend. This is a clear mishmash of Hellenism that we start to see, and this is why a cult like Christianity could arise, in my opinion. Anyway, I'll shut up.
No, I found that absolutely fascinating. I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard similar viewpoints before. I think it's called the Copenhagen School, which
Yes.
the Greek version of the Old Testament with the Septuagint or whatever was the first version of the Old Testament. But I'm not that well read into the arguments about it. So yeah, I would love to get a hold of this book.
Yeah, he takes the Copenhagen School approach. Thomas L. Thompson, which is one of the guys from the Copenhagen School, saw what he wrote. He's not even a PhD. He's a writer, prolific researcher and writer. And when he found this guy's book, Russell Gamirkin, he said, we have to publish this. This is unbelievable. And what made it unique, the title in the book is literally the Achilles heel, if he's right. Plato and the creation of the Hebrew Bible. You can show parallels. He opens it up in the first chapter and says, guys, You see the Greek parallels? This is what the scholars have been saying about the parallels to the Greek culture's laws in the Bible. When you find parallels to the Greeks, all that is, according to these scholars, is a long, long time ago, somewhere along the Levant, the Greeks bumped shoulders with someone that bumped shoulders with the Israelites or had direct contact. We have no evidence of how. We have no evidence of who. We have no evidence of when. But it happened at some point way a long, long time ago, and this is where the Greek stuff found its way into the Hebrew Bible. This guy says, listen, that theory doesn't work anymore, and let me tell you why. And the whole book lays out, because he shows not just Greek influence, he shows laws that don't exist in antiquity, but only exclusively in Plato's laws, Plato's writings. So how did they find their way? The least you could say is they were interpolated. The most you could say is when it was developed, they incorporated at the Alexandrian library with all of the other sources that they had at their disposal to create something that we call the Hebrew Bible. And I thought it was a fascinating book, dude. It was so fascinating, 326 pages. I read it in 8 hours. I never consumed books that quick. I was here, and on my computer screen, it's wide, so I could like zoom through it, and I was consuming it, man.
Damn, yeah, I'll have to get a hold of this.
It's good, but it's a little expensive, so you might want to get it on ebook if you could read ebook.
Expensive is the name of the game in this line of work, or I guess hobby. You know,
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen some of the books we have to quote from if you try to order a copy. They're basically like college textbooks, $200, $300 and shit.
Well, you and Derek, man, Derek, the last episode I did, there's so much more I know you have, Derek, that you want to talk about and you can cover in the next episodes. I really want to keep this trio going because we piggyback off each other, and Derek kept centering us back on something important that I think is relevant right now, and that's the Litwa assessment of mythicism lately, since he came out with his recent book and criticizing Dr. Carrier and mythicism. Not saying I'm agnostic too, guys. Like, we have a trio of agnosticism here when it comes to whether there was a guy at the base. None of us know with certainty. We're open-minded to the conclusion that he may not have. We are open-minded to the idea that he could have, even though we kind of wonder, well, then what or who was he? Was he a rebel? Was he a Stoic philosopher? Was he a magician? You know, like, there's so many different Jesus.
More and more, I'm starting to think he was a Jew, to be honest.
Over against what?
That just, when I read the red ink, it's like that. This is.
I think Celsus would disagree with you when he was born by Pantheris, according to Celsus. You know. Anyway,
Hey,
yes.
with regard to Litwa, I just, the guy's a great scholar. I just was kind of caught sideways by that particular chapter and his discussion of that material. I'm going to cover that, though, in a blog. It is tentatively titled Rising Gods, Ideal Types, and Cultural Context. So I'm a much better writer than I am speaker, in case you hadn't noticed. Sorry, guys.
Oh, I noticed.
But I'm gonna cover that in much greater detail in the blog, and so you all can look forward to that. And that's all I got.
Go down in the description if you guys are watching this. Check out both of their materials. You've got a whole website, Neal, like covering a vast. It wasn't aliens; it was aliens. No, I'm just kidding. You have some really funny, cool blogs.
That was great too. Yeah, that was.
I know, man. But seriously, go check them all out. Show them some love, and maybe at some point we can do this again here soon and talk about topics. Guys, drop a comment down on the video. Derek and Neal will keep an eye on the comments section if you guys have questions. But we'll try and cover some ideas that you guys bring up down in the description. It sounds like we haven't even opened the door with you, Neal, when it comes to numbers and star patterns and all that good stuff. So I look forward to that.
Definitely. I love to get my nerd on about this stuff, as they say.
Food is ready, gentlemen. And with that, don't forget, we are MythVision. Join our Patreon
MythVision.